I was regarded at Harvard Business School as being a communist.
A brief is setting out your ambition. The brief from the Pope was make them believe.
This one is a bit of a mystery still, when my first tweet is going to happen.
It takes the same amount of energy to try and do something great as it does to justify something average.
If I was a CMO and I'd give them a 3-word brief, make us famous.
Welcome back, everybody, to WFA Better Marketing, and I hope you had a great summer and it extended through September. And a special welcome today to our very special guest, Susan Akkad, who's got the glorious title of Senior Vice President of Local and Cultural Innovation. She will actually explain what that is in a minute. So, welcome, Susan. Fantastic to have you take part here, and thank you too for all the work you do for the WFA. It's massively appreciated by everybody at the team, and I know you've had an incredible impact. But where I'd like to start is, how did somebody who studied Near Eastern languages and culture, and by the way, what are Near Eastern languages, how did you get from there to here? I'd love to hear your story.
Well, thank you so much, David. I'm so excited to be here and speak with you today. I am a little bit of a happy accident in the beauty business or marketing in general. I was a Near Eastern languages major, which really was just sort of old school terminology for the Middle East. I specialized in 9th to 14th century. I was very interested in culture and art and literature. And to be honest, I thought that I was going to join the Peace Corps after college and then take the U.S. Foreign Service exam, and really saw myself with a career in the diplomatic corps because of my love of culture and travel. And I unexpectedly met my husband when I was in college. Didn't expect to, meet the person I would be spending the next 40 years of my life with at such a young age. And that whole plan was a one-person plan versus a two-person plan. So I love to write, always loved journalism, thought perhaps that might be another avenue. And just out of college, I started applying for roles in publishing and magazines, and someone suggested that I look at public relations departments of companies. And that's how I found my way to the Estée Lauder Companies. I love beauty and style. But I really came in through my love of writing to the public relations department as an assistant way back in the olden time of the mid-'80s.
I think I read that you had 2 job offers at the same time. Can you tell us about that?
I did. Both of them were entry level. Those days, they barely could cover, your rent in a Manhattan apartment. And so I had an offer to be an editorial assistant to the sportswear editor at American Vogue, and I had the offer to be the public relations assistant at Estée Lauder, and the Estée Lauder role paid $500 more a year.
Oh, a year. Yeah.
So when you're 22.
I don't want to be indiscreet and ask when that was, but probably quite a lot of money a couple of years ago.
It did. This was 1986.
Right.
And so, when you're 22, and living the downtown life as a young person, that was the deal maker.
But astonishingly, you've spent most of your corporate career, in fact, all of your corporate career with Estée Lauder. I know you left and started and sold a fashion business. Was that fun?
It was my husband's company, and it was a lot of fun. I left my role in the public relations department at that sort of entry level when my husband started his design business, and I thought that I was just going to be helping him out with some media and press, etc., for a couple of years, and I would return, and it ended up being 10 years. It was a fantastic experience. It also, in some ways, set me up a little bit for what I do now, in that, we were an American company, but we had a lot of operations in France, our resources, fabric mills, development. And I, sort of grew up in those early years understanding a different business culture. So, and that served me well. I didn't know at the time, but that really served me well when I returned to the beauty business.
And when you went back to Estée Lauder, I think you went into the marketing side. But can I kind of leap ahead and can you just explain? You've got one of those titles that you look at and go, "What on earth is that?" Can you explain that to us, and then maybe go backwards and tell us the experience you've accumulated?
Exactly. I know my title really tells you nothing about what I actually do. So, my role at the company for the last, I guess it's been 13 years now. I've been in this role since 2008. I actually really created the discipline, which is a center of expertise focused on skin of color consumers. And then more recently, I've also have a focus on ageless consumers, which is exciting since I'm
Ageless.
both.
Oh, I like that.
Both. And what it means is that I really support all of our brands. We have many brands within the Estée Lauder Companies, as well as our various functions. It might be the marketing function, the product development function, strategy, on improving our relevancy to people of color globally. Be that in the actual product innovation piece, the communication, marketing communication, advertising, earned media, owned media, paid media. So it's a hybrid role. I like to say it's a combination of product development, marketing, and strategy, sort of rolled into one. Wow. Focused on people of color and now ageless as well.
Going backwards, you've also done every side of the marketing mix, I think, for various brands. What was your favorite job along the way?
It's so hard to pick. I think when I returned to the company, I returned on the Clinique brand, and that was particularly special for me because I had been a customer since I was about 17. It's a little bit the story of a lot of people who use that brand. You're taken by your mom to the counter. In my case, I discovered Clinique when I was in college, my freshman year at university, and I just have extremely sensitive skin, and found my way to that brand and have been a user for decades. So it was really a special role because I was the vice president of global skincare marketing, to actually be part of the team developing the skincare products, where that was the whole reason that I had found my way into that brand. So it holds a particularly special place in my heart for that reason.
And how have you managed to kind of build the career that's having you in a role which I think gives you a real impact, where you can make an absolute difference, especially to this notion of inclusive beauty? I mean, wander us a little bit through there, because fantastic that a company's given you a career. Not many do these days.
I am incredibly fortunate, that the company sort of trusted me to build this, and really sort of gave me the freedom to define what it was going to be, because there really was no definition. I think what really paved the way was, number one, I probably had done all jobs. I really started ground up within the industry. I think that's an incredible help, both in terms of how you manage your people, but also the perspective that you have. And then I had been fortunate to have spent a lot of time in different markets of the world. When I was on the Clinique brand, I spent a lot of time in Japan and Korea, learning about beauty practices and really strengthening our relevance to the Japanese consumer. And what I didn't know when I was in that more sort of traditional, brand marketing role, where I had a lot of close association with research and development and product development. So I learned a huge amount of things that were really outside of technically my scope about formulation and skin science, was that experience of increasing relevancy in Japan was the same blueprint of increasing relevancy anywhere. The content is different, but the approach about how you think about being relevant as a global company in different markets of the world was really the same. So as I look back upon my career and the different areas, so in that particular role, I think I was very focused on product and culture, learned a huge amount on science. I was also the head of global marketing for the Origins brand. So this was a brand that had its own retail stores. And so as a marketer, you were also very much a retail marketer. And your competition wasn't just in the product category, it was with anything that could give somebody, pleasure and entertainment in the mall. You are competing with a movie theater ticket. You're competing with all of these different things. So the retail perspective from that role and what was the experience that people had coming into stores was a whole new marketing skill set add, which was fantastic. And then I spent some time on the communication side as head of global communications and artist relations for MAC Cosmetics and the MAC AIDS Fund. And that experience on the communication side, particularly because MAC is so embedded within the fashion community, the entertainment community, both the artists that work for the brand, but also the professional makeup artists of Hollywood or theater or film all over the world, Bollywood, Nollywood, etc., was incredibly illuminating, and then really made me a better marketer because of that experience on the earned media side and being close to the consumer from that creativity, hyper style perspective. So I think every role just added a little bit to the mix. Because currently I touch a lot of things from marketing, product development, support of the comms teams as well, reputational advancement of our company as well.
So just kind of hovering over a couple of things that the WFA have been working on along the way. I mean, how do you think marketing is doing in the representation of advertising in general against this? And let's include here diversity, inclusion, and equality in its full scope. How do you think we're doing?
It's such a great question because I think one of the things that has been sort of illuminating from the census that the WFA conducted with great participation, and it's also been such a great learning for me to be working with colleagues from all over the world, is that it's a bit piecey. It depends upon which population that you're talking about. So in some cases, the results of the census, we're talking about, the representation of women. But in the beauty business, we're predominantly women. So that wasn't necessarily, the applicable, say, in the beauty business. I think that brands certainly have done tremendous work just in beauty and marketing and in general. But I think that what's really been shown, particularly over the last couple of years, is that society has changed, the consumer has changed, the market has changed, the expectation of the depth of how you express real inclusion and real portrayal the bar has gone up. Simply having, diverse models from an ethnicity or an age or a body size or disability perspective is no longer enough because the consumer expects that. So they're really expecting a deeper portrayal and understanding of different ages and cultures and areas of inclusion, and how you represent that in media can be challenging. You might have 30 seconds, 15 seconds. You can't necessarily tell the depth of story you might want to tell. And I think that's really the work to be done is how do we increase our depth of portrayal, very often, in limited time or depending upon the medium that we're operating in.
And which countries do you think are making the most progress? I mean, as you look, because I think this is one of those areas where the world is uneven in its execution, actually, and just good pods of progress, I would say. But from your perspective?
It's a great question. I think, so I'm based here in the U.S., although my role is global. And I think that because there has been so much focus on the racial reckoning in the U.S., in the last couple of years, that there's a particularly heightened consumer expectation in the United States. And not that that's not the case in many parts of the world, but we're acutely aware of it here because consumers are holding brands accountable and voting with their pocketbooks. They're voting with their pocketbooks in terms of the level of citizenship and social responsibility They're demanding transparency in, your internal employee numbers. Their expectation is just incredibly high, and just with a lot of the insights work that we've done, there's certain populations where that's more important than others. So it's particularly important for Black Americans in terms of which brands they find are representative or in alignment. But I think what's really interesting, and I think it's probably true across multiple markets, is it's not just the group that might have been historically excluded that showing up in a highly inclusive way is meaningful. It's meaningful to everyone. Yeah. It's just no longer modern to anybody. So this idea of targeted efforts it almost has a new mental frame, because those efforts are not just for the benefit of the particular age or ethnicity group. That's the expectation of being in a modern and progressive world.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I've enjoyed watching is people inside companies are finding their voice a whole lot more as well, and calling out things that they see their company doing inappropriately, which didn't used to happen pre the old pandemic. On the whole Black Lives Matter movement, do you think that's accelerated the awareness and the need to execute more thoughtfully especially against the racial agenda? And we'll come on to ageism in a minute.
Without a doubt. I think that our brands have been in the inclusive beauty space for decades, both from a product relevancy perspective, communication. But I think that everything that happened, in May 2020 around, the death of George Floyd, not that the Black Lives Matter movement didn't exist prior to that, but just the acceleration and the attention, really was asking for a new level of commitment on the part of the consumer that they could see.
Yeah.
And I think for many of us, where there had been an incredible level of commitment, perhaps it wasn't as visible as it needed to be, or the consumer wasn't aware of the extensive, clinical research and, collaborations with our, research and development teams, with dermatologists of color, or in the space of really being expert on the physiology of Black skin, for example. That was all very internal and behind the scenes. So people may not have known, or we may not have thought that that was as meaningful to share with a consumer as it is today. So I think what's happened is you have two things. I think you have increased activity in the marketplace, increased competition, lots of new entrants that are a little bit more hyper-targeted against particular groups. And then I think for large companies like ours, where our brands are really generalist brands and most of our products are generalist products, is the need to be to over-communicate our process and our understanding, because it's important for people to know.
And I think urban myth, it probably is urban myth, has it that yours is one of those sectors that is relatively recession proof. So, as we're watching a worldwide financial crisis at a personal level, I would say, rather than a corporate one, beauty products have always been in the box mark. You give yourself a little treat regardless of how expensive your gas and electricity is. Is that a reality? Are you worried about what's coming next?
Well, of course, I think every big global company is monitoring closely, because the world is so interconnected in terms of economic or geopolitical volatility, impacts on supply chains, etc. But from a consumer perspective, Mr. Leonard Lauder, used to coin the phrase the lipstick index. And the correlation of, economy or consumer nervousness with, lipstick sales. It was always this recession-proof business. And I think even back in U.S. history to World War II, the beauty industry was one of those industries that was never shut down. It was almost, standard issue to include lipsticks with women who were serving in uniform. So there's this long history of the importance of beauty as self-expression, confidence, the little treat, exactly, as you've said, you might not be able to afford that, say, more expensive handbag, but you can, easily treat yourself to a really fabulous lipstick, and pull that out of your purse. So it's always been a bit of a reward, but it's also very much an artistic expression. And so I also think when you're in times of financial volatility, you want to treat yourself and be able to express yourself and just have that bit of creativity as much as that treat.
And on that, I mean, I think this is also a category where the impact of social media has been astonishing, actually, and by which I mean both the good and the bad of that. And the pressure, especially on the Instagram generation, of how they look and how they feel. I mean, how are you seeing that? Are you feeling that you're, as a company, managing well those kind of pressures and using social media smartly? Unlikely to say no, actually.
I generally think that we are. I think that we're just seeing such an interesting cycle happening right now. So, with the advent of the beauty influencer and, a lot of the struggles from, our good friends in sort of the traditional media publishing world, we really saw the loss of the traditional beauty editor or beauty journalist as there was this like democratization that was enabled by social media. And it increased also the fragmentation of the media. You were no longer able to use mass media, which was, the backbone of our industry and many industries for forever. So, it really had to fundamentally change what it meant, what your skill set was as a marketer. And I think that, we rose to the challenge, and the really great thing is we recognized what we didn't know. A lot of us, when I started, this wasn't an area of expertise for me or for my colleagues, and we had to learn and be agile, whether we were participants actively or not. And then now I think, exactly as you were saying, and there was so much discussion about social pressures on young girls, particularly just from the whole, Instagram generation, because you're not just sort of, comparing yourself maybe to a supermodel. You were comparing yourself to an influencer, and then you were comparing yourself to your friends. So there's just all of that sort of pressure. I do think that we're seeing a bit of, happily, a bit of a decline maybe in that kind of pressure coming out of COVID, because I think everybody's had a little bit of a reevaluation of what's important. And things are a little bit more natural, quote unquote natural, for lack of a better word. And just, also, outside of just this marketing or beauty conversation, I'm just really happy to see the rise of just more conversations around mental health and mental wellness, particularly for young women vis-a-vis beauty.
Yeah, because I think the heady cocktail of things that have happened in recent times have made it a tough place in all sorts of ways. And I was reading yesterday, I think the ANA have started to try and put metrics around, as they coined it, return on influencer. And when those metrics look every bit as dodgy as the first wave of metrics around, the likes and shares on Facebook, for instance. I mean, do you use influencers, and how do you evaluate them, and how do you kind of police them to make sure it's a safe space for everybody?
Well, yes, absolutely we do. And, one thing I would maybe, also add when thinking about influencers is that, when you're talking about the inclusive beauty space, whether you're talking about ethnicity or age, either, the younger, Generation Z or boomers, the positive part about social media is being able to see someone like yourself. And so as much as, there have been some of the things that we really have to watch out, in terms of people feeling an undue pressure, in the mass media world, it was one mass image of what was considered beautiful for a particular country. And so I can also cite the real positives of people being able to see people like themselves as experts, as beautiful, and in our case in the beauty industry, how you can make a trend work for your skin tone, for your eye shape, for your facial structures. And so there's a huge positive piece of it for sure. So yes, we absolutely use influencers. I'm a little less involved in the influencer selection because that's such a local market decision, and generally influencers are so much more effective when sort of vetted and identified through a local market to deeply understand, their following, their content, their positivity, etc. So that's a little bit less in my global role, other than really understanding the value of diverse influencers to be able to speak to diverse consumers.
Yeah. Can we now perhaps move to subject dear to my heart, which is indeed the ageless consumer and ageism in general. So if I use the UK as a for instance, the advertising industry is really a young person's business. You don't walk into many agencies and see people with my hair colour unless they paid for it to be like that, or my age. I always found it interesting when I was in the States. Not so. You see, it's a much more balanced profile, and obviously what that turns into is a kind of bias of media plans, bias of execution, and in a way it's not surprising that we look at what we consider to be ageism. I'm not sure that it is, but what's your view, and how are you adding that to the agenda both inside Estée Lauder and with the WFA?
Well, a lot of the focus of our work is how we're showing up to the consumer, and how diverse your teams are is so important to how you show up to the consumer. So there's the sort of the internal, inclusion, diversity, equity work to ensure, inclusion of all ages and points of view. And, one of the things that we've done recently at the Estée Lauder Companies, which I'm super excited about, is we have a new employee resource group that's focused on ageless employees. So in all of our employee resource groups, you can join regardless of whether you're of the particular identity or not. But it was so incredibly well received, and sort of the content and the programming, and it's just a wealth of wisdom, also as inspiration for product innovation or influencers or all kinds of things. So that's super exciting on our internal side. But then on the external side, and I would argue the UK is a little bit ahead of the US in terms of how the beauty industry is perhaps showing up. And I think a little bit of that is, even though our cultures are rather similar in America and the UK, the Hollywood influence, I think, can't be understated, with our youth obsession in the United States. And we're a bit of a more hyperbolic country. You would never say, in the UK, I want the greatest skin ever. It's like, I really like some good skin. Yeah. We're just a very hyperbolic culture. And so that can show up in a bit of this youth obsession. So a lot of our work, as we're sort of deeply understanding how aging affects your skin and your hair, and therefore your requirements, but a huge piece of it is the communication and the positivity around not just aging, but aging and being and looking and feeling beautiful. Because there's lots of cultures that revere age from a wisdom perspective, and I feel like part of my mission is to have that same reverence specifically applied to beauty and not just lived experience, because that's our industry. It's very close to my heart as well as a proud baby boomer.
Yeah, because obviously if I look at which sector shall I pick on? Probably financial services is where I see it in its most cliched form. That my generation and how they're represented. You look at that and go, really? And indeed, I've talked before about the failing of personalized advertising, because I get regular ads for those things that make me feel great, like stair lifts and walk-in baths and all those things that remind me of the age I am, even though I don't feel like that. What I don't get is much targeting to do with my interests, my activity, and what's going on in here, not just on the outside.
Exactly.
And how do you help influence media choices in all of this through your role? Because I think it's a role that many companies could benefit from, actually, because you've got the freedom to help people and to interfere and stop them when they're going wrong, I guess.
Well, exactly. Well, we really try to dig in to look at, media preferences and consumption. And in some ways, if you're a part of Generation X or a baby boomer generation in the U.S., although media is fragmented today, it wasn't fragmented when we were growing up, right? And so there's a lot of shared, lived experiences, cultural experiences that can really inform our storytelling, the relevancy of our messaging. In some ways, it might even be easier than Gen Z because, in the United States, there were 3 television networks when I was growing up. It was the same programming. So even if, there's of course lots of, ethnic and regional diversity, there's so much common and shared experience until relatively recently. So really the key now is you've had those shared experiences, but you're now in a fragmented media universe. And also with changes in privacy laws, the way, your creative is more important than ever because the targeting abilities are not what they used to be because of a lot of the new privacy laws in the United States. So for us, I think we're really encouraging and supporting our brands more than ever in the positive representation and deep insights translated into the creative. Because the creative just has to work harder.
And if when I was looking at the Cannes work this year, just through this lens, you would say actually that there's some visible progress being made, but not enough actually. And it's notable that there isn't really any award that celebrates people who are being smart about this space. And a bit like, it's extraordinary that after all, this is the first year that Cannes has ever had a B2B, award. Wakey. I mean, there's been B2B's been going on for a long while. So I think it would help if people were awarded for doing the right thing in the right way as well. Would you agree with that?
I would completely agree. I think that would be, wonderful motivation, but also a recognition, for there's lots of people who have really been in this space for quite a while. And nothing is as motivating as being recognized, for work. And I also think in the marketing space, really being recognized for sort of the nuanced work and for some of the soft skills, because this work is so dependent upon empathy. And, that's the key to relevancy, whether it's a consumer group or different markets, is not just in a cliched way, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, but really doing the hard work of neutralizing your own bias, really doing the hard work of soliciting opinions from other lived experiences, really doing the hard work in recruiting from different diverse backgrounds so that you have dynamic and diverse teams. And it's not necessarily always seen. There's no empathy measure on most people's performance reviews. But if you don't have that, I think it's almost impossible to be an excellent marketer.
Oh, no, 100%. I mean, that allied to, being a cod psychologist, understanding people and being able to empathize and always see somebody's other side strikes me as the thing. All the great marketers I've ever met have that in common. And there aren't that many who dial up high on empathy, which I think is, ever more important, actually. And I know, speaking of recognition, congratulations. I love the fact that you were just given a BRAG award, and you haven't bragged about it, but for those that don't know what BRAG is, that's the Black Retail Action Group. I think that was very recently. Could you share with us what that award was about and how it made you feel?
Yes, that was a Business Innovation Award, and actually that one I had received a little bit while back. And that's a U.S. organization that probably one of their signature programs is sort of a scholarship program to support young, diverse talent who want to go into the retail industries, predominantly in fashion and in beauty, and to really give them that sort of leg up for that first internship or mentorship program that would then set them up for an even more premium internship that would lead to sort of long-term work. And so I had served on the advisory board of Bragg for a number of years. I'm no longer on that advisory board because of some other commitments. And probably the biggest commitment now that I love is I'm on the board of trustees of Cosmetic Executive Women, and had received their Achiever Award just earlier this year.
Okay.
And I also do quite a bit of work on their D&I task force. And that's really an organization that many women in the beauty industry are members of, whose real goal is advancing women in beauty.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a wonderful space that's not your company to have these kinds of conversations about, pay equity or opportunity or mentorship, sponsorship. And we've done quite a lot of work in the D&I task force there that really mirrors a lot of the results that came from the WFA census. Startlingly similar in terms of how people feel, how much people feel included and advancement opportunities within the industry.
That's fantastic, but it is it's an industry that doesn't always say thank you, so it's lovely when you get it, isn't it? We get recognised at the tail end, not often along the way. I mean, I'm at the tail end, you're very not.
It was wonderful. It was such a proud moment. And also, because of the, COVID, there hadn't been the big in-person, award event in a couple of years, and it was the first time in a couple of years to have sort of the big luncheon, which I affectionately refer to as like the big beauty family, family reunion, because it's a small industry. We all know each other, and so there was something also just so wonderful about seeing so many of my colleagues that are no longer, that I necessarily work with directly, but it was just a big family reunion.
So, a couple of questions we always like to end with, Susan. One is, if each person watching this, each marketeer could do one thing differently and one thing better in their job, what would that be? I think I might know what you're going to say here.
Well, we spoke about empathy, but I also think having a reverence for culture is very important. And whether it's in your home market, one of the things I've learned is, even though I'm an American, I'm not an expert on all Americans, and apply the same kind of rigor even in your native culture that you might apply in one that is less familiar to you, which of course includes that empathy for how people live and how they experience, whatever they do that affects your business, in my case in the beauty business, but also not just an observation of the culture, but to really have a respect for it and deeply understand it. It's not just personally rewarding, if you're sort of a culture geek like myself, but it makes you a better marketer. And there's no substitute for talking to people.
Fantastic.
Not emailing them,
Right.
but talking, and that's how you get to understand culture, is through that one-on-one. It doesn't have to be in person, it can be, over Zoom.
Yeah.
But just really talking to people to understand their perspective.
All right, Susan. And then finally, what's the single most important thing that CMOs should have top of their agenda, top of their to-do lists?
Well, I'm sort of borrowing this from our CEO. I so violently agree with it, is being a learner. The world is changing so fast. Consumers are changing so fast. And making sure that you're not stuck on old ideas. So I think the most important thing is to have just the passion for learning and actively engage in it, so that you can be as current and open and thoughtful as the world changes as you can be.
Wonderful. That's very sound advice. And Susan, thank you so much again for all your support of the WFA. The team appreciate it hugely. You're making a real difference. And thank you very much for taking your time to talk to me today. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Oh, it was so delightful to speak with you today. Thank you so much for having me on the Better Marketing Podcast.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. The problem with these discussions is I could talk for ages, as you could probably tell. But if you've got any further issues, questions, I think it really is worth connecting through the WFA with Susan and the work that's being done on diversity and inclusion and equality, because it's really important work that needs accelerating fast. We'll be back shortly with episode 21. Meanwhile, take the best of care.